Well, let's bring in Thomas Warrick from Washington, D.C. He's a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's Forward Defense Practice at the Atlantic Council. Previously, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism Policy at the US Department of Homeland Security. Thomas, it's really good to have you on this news hour. Now, Vladimir Putin says he's ready for peace talks, but there's an increase in airstrikes in Ukraine. Is this a tactic by Moscow to force talks by bombing civilian infrastructure?
Very much so, but it appears doomed to fail because there's no amount of power outages that will persuade the Ukrainian people to let them be ruled by Moscow and by Vladimir Putin. What we're seeing is that the military campaign is going to continue well into 2023. Russia still has some bite in its fangs. But the Ukrainian defenses are looking to get stronger month by month. For example, the strikes that occurred over the last couple of nights will become more difficult in about 2 months when the United States' top air defense system, the Patriot missile, gets deployed to protect Kyiv and several other Russian cities. The West was reminded by the Secretary General of NATO yesterday that the best way to bring about peace is to provide Ukraine with the ammunition and weapons that it needs to repel any Russian attacks and to expel Russian forces from Ukrainian territory. So we're looking for a continued military conflict, and that will determine the prospects for any peace talks in 2023.
Okay, so as Ukraine's defenses in the next 2 months look to be strengthened by help from the US, would Washington be concerned by what we saw today, this meeting between Russia and China and growing ties between them, especially when it comes to greater military cooperation? Or do you think Russia's allies are more apprehensive about actively involving themselves in this conflict and supporting it?
Well, you need a little magic decoder ring to understand the subtlety of what Xi and other leaders like the Indian leadership is saying. They're trying to signal to Putin that escalating the war, as some of the more hawkish advisors to Putin seem to be advocating in Moscow, escalating the war would cause grave concerns in Beijing and New Delhi and other countries, because the prospect of Putin being the first leader in modern times to use nuclear or chemical weapons in a European battlefield is one that would give many nations pause around the world. China and India would prefer that Russia end the war. And right now, however, Putin obviously does not seem inclined to do that. It looks like he'll have another go at Ukraine now that the winter has hardened the terrain so that tanks can drive over it. But the prospect for ongoing war is not a particularly pleasing one in either Beijing or New Delhi right now.
Thomas, earlier I spoke to a former Russian diplomat who said Moscow wasn't waging war with Ukraine, but rather with the US, who he said was pulling the strings of Ukraine's government. If negotiations do indeed take place, how big and what kind of role should Washington be taking, or even taking any sort of role at all in peace talks?
Well, this is a standard Russian line to claim that Russia is somehow threatened by NATO when it was Putin's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine that has motivated previously neutral countries like Finland and Sweden to join the NATO alliance. That has to be one of the most strategic defeats that Moscow has faced in half a century. What I think we're likely to see from Washington is a continuation of the bipartisan support that welcomed President Zelensky when he came to the American Capitol a few days ago and spoke very eloquently that what the United States was providing is not charity, but is rather an investment in security for the United States, Europe, and the whole world.
Thomas Warrick, really appreciate your insight and analysis, speaking to us there from the US Capitol. Thanks, Thomas.